The waterfall had roared for 1,000 years before anyone thought to look behind it. It did not invite looking. It commanded attention the way a fire does, or a storm pulling the eye forward, holding it there, filling the ears until there was no room left for anything else. The water came off the cliff face in a single curtain, 60 feet of unbroken white, and hit the pool below with a force that could be felt in the chest from 30 yards away. The mist rose in slow columns and caught what was left of the afternoon light, and the whole thing was so completely itself, so entirely consuming, that a person could stand before it for an hour and never once think to wonder what lay behind. But Wren Calloway was not most people. She had spent her whole life noticing the things that other people walked past. It was not a gift she had chosen or cultivated. It was simply how she was made, the way some people hear a wrong note in a melody while others only hear the song. She noticed the gap in the cliff face behind the falling water on the first evening they camped above the gorge, when the light was low and the fire had just caught, and Silas was still sorting the gear from the wagon. She saw it the way you see something that has been there, all along quietly waiting for the right pair of eyes. She did not say anything immediately. She sat with it the way she sat with most things, turned it over, looked again. By the time Silas came and sat beside her with 2 cups of coffee, she had already decided she was going to find out what it was. Her name before she married was Wren Aldgate, and she had grown up in a succession of other people's houses. Her father died when she was 6, a riding accident on a hired farm in eastern Kansas. And after that, her mother moved them from one relative's home to the next, never staying long enough to unpack everything, always sleeping in rooms that belonged to someone else, eating at tables where the rhythms and the rules were already established before they arrived. Wren learned early how to read a room, how to understand the unspoken arrangements of a household, how to be present without imposing. She learned to observe before she spoke, to look before she touched, to understand the shape of a thing before she tried to name it. She was not unhappy. That was the part that people sometimes got wrong when she told pieces of this story. She had not been unhappy. She had simply been waiting without knowing quite what she was waiting for, in the quiet and practical way of someone who has learned that patience is not the same as resignation. She met Silas Calloway at a church gathering in a town called Millhaven in the autumn of her 22nd year. He was taller than she expected from across the room, and quieter than she expected when she got closer. He had the hands of someone who worked with them daily, and the eyes of someone who thought carefully before speaking. They talked for a long time that evening about nothing in particular, and when she went home that night, she could not have told you precisely what they had discussed, only that she had felt for the first time, in as long as she could remember, that she was standing exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married 18 months later, after Silas had saved enough to feel he was bringing her something real. He was 25 when they married. She was 23. Neither of them had much, but Silas had always found steady work, and Wren had always found a way to make steady work go further than it should have. And between the two of them there was a kind of practical optimism that neither could have manufactured alone. For 2 years after the wedding, they lived in the foreman's cottage on the Delwood Ranch east of Granton, Colorado, where Silas had worked since before they married. The work was honest, and the pay was just enough. And the cottage was small, but it was theirs in the way that matters most. No one else came through the door without asking. Wren planted a kitchen garden along the south wall. She hung curtains she had made herself. She learned the specific creak of each floorboard and the particular way the west window leaked when the wind came from that direction, and she fixed it with a strip of oilcloth and a careful hand, and it did not leak again. She had been happy there. Not the temporary happiness of a pleasant circumstance, but the quieter and more durable kind that comes from belonging somewhere, from knowing that the ground beneath your feet is the same ground you will stand on tomorrow. And then, in the middle of August, Silas came home from a conversation with the ranch owner and stood in the doorway of the cottage with his hat in his hand and told her that the property had been sold. She had known something was coming before he said it. That was the thing about being the kind of person who noticed. You caught the small signals, the way a conversation stopped when you entered a room, the particular silence between two men who had just finished discussing something they were not going to tell you. She had caught several of those signals over the previous week and had filed them away without alarm, but with attention. Still hearing it said directly was different from suspecting it. She stood at the kitchen counter where she had been working and listened to Silas explain the situation. A land company from back east. New ownership had no use for a ranch hand and his wife in the foreman's cottage. 2 weeks and a handshake. She asked one question. "Did you know before today?" Silas was quiet for a beat too long. "I suspected," he said. "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure." She looked at him steadily. He looked back. It was not an argument and it was not a forgiveness. It was a recognition, the kind that happens between two people who have been together long enough to understand the distance between protecting someone and keeping things from them, and to know that Silas, in this instance, had mistaken one for the other. She did not say that. She didn't need to. He already knew. "All right," she said, and turned back to what she had been doing. "Then we have 2 weeks." But what Wren had not told Silas, what she had not yet told anyone, was what she had heard 3 days before the news came home with him. She had been at the market in Granton buying cornmeal and a few yards of heavy thread when she fell into conversation with an older woman she recognized from the dry goods counter. A woman named Beatrice Holst, who had lived in that valley for 30 years and knew its workings the way old trees know soil. They had spoken before briefly, the pleasant and slightly formal exchanges of women who are acquainted but not close. On this occasion, Beatrice had looked at Wren with an expression that was not quite pity, and not quite warning, but contained elements of both, and had said quietly that she had heard the Delwood had sold. Wren had said she had not heard that yet, and Beatrice had nodded slowly and said that Wren and her husband might be thinking about heading west over the mountains to Harwick, where the land office was still registering homestead claims. Then she had paused, and the expression on her face had shifted slightly. "You should know," she said, "that the good parcels are nearly gone. The big outfits from back east have been buying up the valley land through the summer. What's left will go fast, and what goes last won't be the kind of land you want to stake a life on." Wren had thanked her. She had carried that information home and put it somewhere quiet in her mind, in the same place she put things she was not ready to act on, but was not willing to discard. She had not told Silas. This was not, she understood, a simple thing. She turned it over carefully in the days between hearing it and the day Silas came home with his hat in his hand. She was not the kind of woman who kept things. She believed in plainness and in the practical usefulness of information shared between two people who were making decisions together. But she had watched Silas carefully in those days before the news came, and she had seen the weight he was already carrying, the conversations he was not repeating, the calculations he was running behind his eyes, the deliberate steadiness of a man who is holding himself very carefully because he does not trust what might happen if he puts anything else down. She made a decision that felt less like deception and more like mercy. There would be a moment to tell him, but the moment had to be right. The plan, when they made it together after the news was out, was straightforward enough. Take what they had: a wagon, 2 horses, their tools, their wedding trunk, and $74 and head west over the mountains to Harwick, where the land office was still open and the homestead claims were still available. Get there before winter locked the high passes. File a claim. Start building. Wren listened to this plan and agreed to it with a full heart because she believed in Silas, and she believed in their ability to make something from whatever they found. What she did not tell him was that the foundation of the plan might be shakier than either of them had named out loud. She went instead, carrying the information, the way you carry a stone you have picked up on a path in your hand, aware of its weight, not yet sure whether you will put it down or find a use for it. The mountain road was slower than the map suggested, and harder than either of them had imagined. October came in cold that year, the way it sometimes does in the Colorado high country, without warning and without apology. The mornings arrived with frost on the wagon canvas and ice at the edges of every still pool of water. The pines were already deep in mist by the time they cleared the lower foothills, and the trail, where there was a clear trail at all, had a way of narrowing just when the drop on one side grew most serious. Silas handled the horses with the patience of someone who had worked with animals his whole life. He had a quality of stillness around them that Wren had always found interesting, a capacity to communicate steadiness through posture alone. The horses trusted him completely, which was more than she could say for the trail. They made camp each evening before full dark, and each evening Wren made the best she could of what they had. She was a precise and unsentimental cook, which in the circumstances was the right kind to be. She kept a careful account of their stores in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, noting what they used each day and calculating what remained. The numbers were not alarming, but they required attention. They talked in the evenings the way they always talked, which was plainly and without decoration. They described the house they were going to build. A south-facing slope, Silas said, for the light in winter. A kitchen large enough to actually work in, Wren said. Room to expand the garden. A proper root cellar this time, not that half-dug thing at the Delwood. They talked about it as though it existed already, which it did in the way that anything you intend hard enough exists before it is built. On the 3rd day of the mountain passage, they encountered a family coming the other direction. A man named Rutherford, his wife, and 2 children in a wagon that was considerably more burdened than it had been when they set out. Rutherford had a sunburned look that had nothing to do with the sun and everything to do with disappointment. He pulled up when he saw them, and they exchanged the brief assessing pleasantries of strangers who are sizing up whether information is worth sharing. Rutherford shared his freely. He said the homestead land near Harwick was effectively gone. The valley parcels had been bought through the summer by a consortium out of Cincinnati, and what remained was either already filed by local families or sitting too high and rocky to be worth the proving. The land office was still open technically, but the clerk would tell you the same thing. Silas listened to this without expression. He thanked the man, and the Rutherford family continued east, and Silas sat quiet for a moment on the wagon seat before clicking to the horses. They rode without speaking for a while. The pines closed around them and the mist moved through the upper branches and the trail climbed. "It may not be as bad as he says," Silas said eventually. "It may not be." Wren agreed. She watched the trail ahead of them and said nothing more. The stone in her hand grew heavier. That evening, when she was already in the wagon and Silas thought she was asleep, she lay still and listened to him sit outside by the fire for a long time longer than usual. And she understood that he was running the same calculations she had been running since Granton arriving. At the same conclusions, sitting alone with a fear he was not going to give her until morning. She loved him for that. She also understood that it could not continue much longer, the two of them separately carrying what they should be carrying together. But still she waited because the time was not yet right. They heard the waterfall before they saw it. A low, continuous thunder from somewhere below the trail, and to the left, felt as much as heard a vibration in the sternum that grew steadily as they climbed. The horses registered it first, their ears going forward, their pace shifting slightly. Wren felt it in her chest before she heard it clearly. A deep and rhythmic percussion beneath the ordinary sounds of the mountain. The trail crested a ridge, and Silas pulled the horses to a stop. Below them, in a narrow gorge carved into the mountain face, a waterfall dropped 60 feet from a ledge of dark rock into a churning pool at the base. The spray rose in slow rotating columns, catching the afternoon light in curtains of white mist. The cliff face behind the falling water was dark and wet, and close the rock folded in layers that had taken 10,000 years to arrange themselves the way they stood now. The pool at the base was a deep, cold green, perfectly still at its edges despite the violence of the water hitting its center. It was, Wren thought, the most extravagant and unnecessary thing she had seen in a very long time. The mountains were full of beautiful things, but they were usually the practical sort of beautiful, useful vistas. Timber stands, well-watered meadows. This was something else. This was beauty for its own sake, excessive and indifferent, making no argument for itself. Silas said, "We should push on while the light holds." Wren said, "We camp here tonight." He looked at her. She was already looking at the gorge, her eyes working over the cliff face, the way they always worked over things she was serious about. He held the horses steady, and after a moment said, "All right." They made their camp on a flat shelf of rock above the gorge, sheltered on two sides by a granite outcrop that broke the wind. Silas built the fire while Wren prepared what there was to eat, and after supper they sat together in the warmth of it and listened to the waterfall fill the evening. It was Wren who first spoke about what she saw. "There's a gap in the rock behind the water," she said. She was leaning forward slightly, her elbows on her knees, her eyes fixed on the cliff face across the gorge. "I've been watching it since we sat down. It's not shadow. There's a seam there." Silas looked across the gorge. The light was going fast, and the mist from the waterfall obscured the cliff face in irregular intervals. He studied it for a long moment. Could be the cliff face, he said, the way the layers fold. It could be, Wren said, but it doesn't move the way the rest of the cliff face moves when the mist shifts. Something in there is holding still. Silas was quiet. He looked at it again. Dark already. He said, "We'd have to cross down to the pool to get close enough to tell." "I know that," she said. "I'm not saying tonight." She said nothing more about it. She banked the fire before turning in the way she always did. But she lay awake in the wagon for a long time, looking up at the canvas and listening to the waterfall's steady conversation with the rock below. And she thought about the seam in the cliff face and what it might mean and what it might hold, and whether she was right about what she had seen. She was fairly certain she was right. In the morning, she was up before Silas, standing at the edge of the rock shelf, with her arms folded against the cold, looking at the cliff. The daylight was unambiguous. What the firelight had suggested the morning confirmed completely. There was a vertical seam in the rock face behind the waterfall, a shadow line darker and more deliberate than the surrounding stone, a gap wide enough, she estimated from this distance, for a person to pass through sideways. Silas came up beside her with coffee. He followed her gaze without speaking. She could feel him looking, processing, running the same assessment she had been running since last night. "It's real," she said. "Not a question." "It appears to be," he said. "I want to go look." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was being honest with himself about something. "We're already behind," he said. "A day, maybe two. When was the last time you passed something that made you curious and didn't look?" He didn't answer that, which was between them the same as an answer. They picked their way carefully down to the pool. The descent was steep, and the rocks were slick with dew, and the spray from the waterfall caught them before they were halfway down. Not dramatically, but thoroughly. A cold and pervasive dampness that settled into the fabric of their coats and stayed there. The sound grew as they descended, becoming physical, pressing against the ears, filling the space between thoughts. Silas held Wren's arm as they worked along the edge of the pool toward the cliff. The cold green water a foot to their right, the rock face looming larger as they approached. Up close, the cliff was different than it looked from above, more layered, more complex. The stone colored in bands of dark gray and rust, where water had worked through it over centuries. The gap was real. Standing before it, they could feel the air coming out of it, not cold exactly, but different from the air outside, a steadier temperature, undisturbed. The gap was perhaps 18 inches wide at its widest, the stone on either side dark with permanent moisture. It went in, and then, as far as Wren could see from the entrance, bent slightly so that whatever was beyond it was not visible from where they stood. She pressed her hand against the left face of the rock. Solid. She looked at Silas. "I'll go first," she said. He looked at the width of the gap, and then at his own shoulders, and arrived at the same conclusion she had already reached. He was broader than she was, and the entrance was not built for broad people. "Take it slow," he said. Wren turned sideways, placed her back against one face of the gap and her hands against the other, and began to move. There are moments in a life that exist outside the normal sequence of events. Moments that do not connect forward or backward to anything else, but simply stand alone, complete in themselves. The 12 feet of passage through that gap in the rock was one of those moments for Wren Calloway. The stone was cold and very close. The waterfall, which had been all-consuming outside, fell away behind her, almost immediately replaced by a silence so complete that she could hear her own breathing in a way she normally could not. The sound of the water did not disappear entirely. It came through the rock itself, a vibration rather than a noise felt in the palms and the backs of the shoulders. But it was different, contained like music heard through a wall. She moved carefully, 12 feet. That felt like considerably more in the dark, and the closeness, one hand on each face of the stone, shuffling sideways, the rock pressing against her back and her chest in turns. She thought of nothing in particular. She was entirely present in the way that physical uncertainty makes you present, attending only to the next few inches, the next placement of her feet. And then the stone fell away on both sides, and she stopped. The light was different here. The spray from the waterfall reached this space in a fine and constant mist that softened everything, diffusing what light came through the top of the gorge into something even and gentle without shadow. The sound of the water was present, but contained a constant murmur, rather than a roar, the way a river sounds from a distance. And there, set back against the base of the cliff, built of hand-hewn pine logs with its back wall formed by the cliff face, itself was a cabin. It was small. It was dark. It had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to spaces that have not heard a human voice in a very long time. But it was standing. The walls were upright, the roof line was true, and the door was closed. Wren stood very still and looked at it. She heard Silas working through the gap behind her, the scrape of boots on stone, a brief difficulty at the narrow point where she had also slowed. He came through and straightened up beside her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. What passed between them in that silence was not words and did not need to be. It was of the category of things that exist between two people who have been through enough together to have developed a language beneath language, a communication of recognition of shared weight, of the particular seriousness that accompanies something neither of them had any framework for yet. Silas put his hand on her arm. She did not step back or step forward. She simply stood there and looked at the cabin in the mist-softened light and felt something opening in her chest that she did not have a name for immediately, and understood later was hope of a very specific and precise variety. Not the vague hope of wanting things to be better, but the sharp and almost frightening hope that comes from seeing something actual in front of you. Silas walked the perimeter of the cabin the way he walked any structure he was assessing slowly, with his hands on the logs, pressing at corners, looking up at the eave line. He had learned construction from a man in Oklahoma who believed that buildings told the truth if you listened to them properly, and he had internalized that belief completely. He moved around the cabin's exterior without speaking his face in the expression of concentrated quiet he wore when he was genuinely interested in something. Wren let him work. She stood in the center of the sheltered space and looked around her properly for the first time. The area behind the waterfall was larger than it appeared from the passage. The cliff face curved slightly on both sides, creating a natural courtyard perhaps 40 feet across, and deep the waterfall forming the fourth wall. a wall of white noise and mist that was also somehow the most beautiful wall she had ever seen. The ground was uneven but solid, a mix of flat rock and packed earth. Along the eastern edge, where the gorge wall receded, she could see the ground leveling into what might, in better light and better seasons, be a workable flat of soil. Tall pines grew along that eastern edge, the kind that grew in sheltered places and grew slowly, and therefore grew well. Silas came back around to where she was standing. "She's sound," he said. "Needs work on the roof. A section near the north eave has lifted. South wall wants re-chinking, but the bones are good. Whoever built this knew what they were doing." "How old?" Wren asked. He considered. "Decades, but maintained for most of that time. The disrepair is recent." He looked at the door. "Let's see inside." The door was plain plank construction hung on iron hinges that had gone a deep orange with age, but had not failed. It was latched from outside with a wooden peg dropped through an iron loop, not locked, not barred, simply closed. Silas lifted the peg. The door swung inward on a sound that was half groan and half sigh. The smell that met them was dry stone and old ash and pine, not rot, which was the first important thing. Wren stepped in ahead of Silas. The main room was a single open space, perhaps 30 feet long and 18 wide. The fireplace was built directly into the cliff wall, the stone of which formed the entire back wall of the cabin, meaning the chimney drew through natural channels in the rock. This was, Wren understood immediately, a remarkable piece of planning. No outside chimney to fail, no junction of materials to leak or separate. The cliff itself was the chimney. On either side of the fireplace were built-in shelves still occupied, a tin cup, a small wooden box, several glass jars sealed with wax, a folded piece of oilcloth, a lantern with a cracked chimney glass, the crack wrapped carefully with a length of wire to prevent it from separating further. In one corner stood a bed frame of simple construction. Rope lashed the rope, still strung and functional. A table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, the chairs set as though someone had only recently pushed back from them. Beneath the table, a small crate held hand tools wrapped in canvas, a hatchet, 2 chisels, a draw knife, coils of wire. Wren moved to the shelves and lifted one of the sealed jars. Seeds. She lifted another. More seeds, a different variety. She began counting the jars quietly. 7 in all, each sealed carefully with a layer of wax that had been applied with attention, not hastily. She lifted the folded oilcloth. Beneath it was a folded piece of paper. She held it for a moment without opening it, looking at what was written on the outside in an old-fashioned and deliberate hand. The letters were formed with care, as though the writer had wanted them to last. "To whoever finds this place and enters with honest intent." Silas had crouched at the fireplace and was looking up the draw. "It's clear," he said, with something close to wonder in his voice. A fireplace that had sat untended for years, and the draw was still clear. "Silas." He turned. She held up the paper. He crossed the room and stood beside her and read the words on the outside. He looked at her face. She looked back at him. "Open it," he said. She unfolded it carefully, treating it the way you treat something that has been waiting, with attention, with patience, without rushing. The letter was 2 pages written on both sides, in the same deliberate hand. The author gave his name as Augustine Merrow, a name neither of them recognized. He wrote that he had built this cabin in 1861, in the years before the war reached west, when he had come out from Pennsylvania alone as a younger man, with nothing but a set of tools and the willingness to use them until something worth having appeared. He had found this place by accident. He wrote sheltering from a storm beside the pool at the base of the waterfall, and had seen the gap in the rock. He had gone through it out of nothing more than a refusal to let a mystery stand unanswered. What he found on the other side had changed the direction of his life entirely. He had lived here for more than 20 years, he wrote. The location had proved over time to be remarkable, sheltered from wind by the cliff on 3 sides, watered by a spring that fed directly into the cabin through a carved stone channel, protected from the worst of the mountain winters by the thermal mass of the rock. He had been happy here. He wrote in the way that a man who asks very little of the world and receives a great deal from silence can be happy. But he had grown old. His knees had given way in the manner of knees that have spent decades in mountain country. He could no longer keep the place properly. He had no children and no family remaining who would come. And so he had gone to the land office in Harwick and filed a deed on the property. And he had brought that deed back here and left it in a deliberate place because he had a particular wish about who should receive it. He did not want the property to pass to the first person who arrived with money and legal standing. He had thought about this for years, he wrote, with the careful patience of a man who has spent a long time in his own company and has consequently become very precise about what he actually thinks and wants. And what he had decided was this. He wanted the cabin to go to the first person who found it, not by accident, not by being told, by being the kind of person who notices what other people walk past, who takes seriously the things that other people dismiss as shadow and trick of light, by entering honestly without breaking what was closed, by staying long enough to read what he had left. That was the person he had in mind. Wren's voice was steady as she read, but her hands had tightened on the paper. Merrow went on. The deed was properly drawn and witnessed by the Harwick Land Office, he wrote. It transferred ownership to the bearer of this letter upon registration at that same office, provided the bearer could demonstrate intent to inhabit and work the land. The taxes on the property had been paid forward at the time of filing. He asked only one thing of whoever received the place, that they care for it the way it had cared for him. And then he closed. You are standing in a good house. The spring does not fail. The soil in the sheltered flat to the east grows kitchen crops without much coaxing. I have left what I could. The rest you will find yourself. I hope you are young. I hope you are not alone. I hope this place gives you what it gave me, which was time enough to know what matters. A Merrow Wren folded the letter. The silence that followed was the particular kind that comes after something enormous, when the mind needs a moment to rearrange itself around a new fact. There's a deed, Silas said. Not quite a question. Wren unfolded the second page. It was heavier paper, formal in its layout, with 2 signatures below the transfer language and a date autumn of 1883. 6 years ago. Augustine Merrow had filed this and left it here 6 years ago, and had waited apparently for the right person to walk through the rock and find it. Silas stood slowly. He went to the door and looked out at the sheltered courtyard. and the tall pines along the eastern edge at the ground that leveled toward the flat that Merrow had described. He came back inside. He sat down in one of the old chairs, and it held his weight without complaint. Wren looked at him across the small room. "We were going to Harwick anyway," she said quietly. He nodded. "To file a claim," she said. "This is a claim," he said. He turned the thought over in the careful, thorough way he turned all serious things. If the deed is legitimate and it reads legitimate, we'd need the land office to confirm. That's a day's ride from here, maybe less on horseback. Wren was quiet for a moment. Then she walked to the north wall of the cabin where a narrow stone channel had been carved directly into the rock floor, barely 4 inches wide, running from a crack in the base of the cliff to a small collection basin fitted with a flat stone cover. She lifted the cover. Cold, clean water ran steadily in the channel, a thin and constant thread. She looked at it for a long moment. "The spring," she said. "He said it doesn't fail." Silas came and put his hand in the water. He held it there for a moment, feeling the temperature, feeling the steadiness of the flow. He said nothing. Wren set the stone cover back carefully. She stood up and looked at the room, the fireplace built into living rock, the sealed jars of seeds, the tools in their canvas wrappings, the bed in the corner with its rope still strung. She looked at all of it with the eyes of someone who has spent her whole life in other people's rooms and knows with a precision that requires no argument the difference between a place that is borrowed and a place that is yours. She looked at Silas. "I think this is it," he said. Their fireplace threw dim light across the old stone walls. "I think so too," she said. But then Wren did something Silas did not expect. She read the second page of the letter again, carefully, all the way to the end. And when she finished, she looked up with an expression he had seen only a few times before, the expression she wore when she had found something that other people had missed, when the world had shown her a seam in the rock that everyone else had walked past. "There's a condition," she said. Silas waited. "We have 30 days, she said, from when we found the letter, to go to Harwick, to stand in front of the land clerk and declare intent." She paused. "There's no date on the letter, no date on the envelope. We don't know how long it's been since someone else was here." The room was quiet except for the sound of the waterfall muffled through the rock ever present. "Which means," Silas said slowly, "the clock is already running." "It's already running," Wren said. "We just don't know from when." She folded the letter again and placed it carefully inside her coat close to her chest. She looked at the room one more time, the spring, the fireplace, the seeds on the shelf, the tools in their canvas. Then she looked at Silas with the calm, level expression of a woman who has spent her whole life understanding exactly what a situation requires. "Then we had better not waste any more time," she said. The first morning in the cabin, Wren was up before the light. She had slept in the bed in the corner, the rope frame holding better than she had expected the wool blanket from the storage alcove she had discovered near dusk the previous evening, adding enough warmth that the cold did not reach her until just before dawn. Silas had taken the floor with the bedroll from the wagon which he had carried through the gap in 2 careful trips before the last of the daylight went. He slept the way he always slept outdoors, flat on his back, arms at his sides, utterly still. Wren did not disturb him. She built the fire first, working by the feel of it in the near dark, finding the stone arch of the fireplace with her hands arranging what remained of the wood they had brought through from the shelf above. The chimney drew immediately, pulling the smoke up through whatever natural channel Augustin Merrow had identified in the cliff face decades ago, and the fire caught clean and fast, and threw its light across the room in the particular amber way of fires that know what they are doing. She stood back and looked at the room by firelight. It looked different than it had the evening before, less like a discovery and more like a fact. The walls were still. The ceiling log was still above her, water-stained in one spot near the north eave, but otherwise solid. The shelves held their jars of seeds and their tin cup and their lantern with its cracked and wire-wrapped chimney glass. The tools sat in the crate under the table. The stone channel carried its thin, steady thread of cold water to the basin near the north wall. Everything was where it had been. Everything was waiting. Wren took out her small notebook and sat by the fire and began making a list. She was not by temperament a person who found disorder comfortable. Disorder was not the same as difficulty. She had no objection to difficulty, had in fact spent most of her life making peace with it. But disorder, the kind that came from not knowing what needed doing and in what order, was something she addressed as quickly as possible. The list was her first act of ownership more than anything she had said or felt the evening before. She wrote roof north eave section, south wall chinking, water channel inspect full length, firewood immediate, inventory all stores, assess flat to the east. Then she added at the bottom Harwick, and beneath that underlined once how many days. She woke Silas at full light. He sat up and took the situation in the way he always took new situations, quietly, completely, without the groggy confusion that some people carry out of sleep. He looked at the fire, at the light coming through the two small windows, at Wren sitting across the room with her notebook and a cup of water heated on the hearthstone. "What time?" he said. "Early," she said, "but we have work." He stood up and she handed him the list. He read it standing, one hand resting on the table that had been Augustin Merrow's table, his eyes moving down the items in order. When he finished, he looked at her and said, "Harwick first. Work first," she said. "We need to be able to tell them what we've done. An empty claim is a weak claim. 4 days of work, then, Harwick." He considered this and found nothing wrong with it. "The roof first, then," he said, "before any more weather comes in." "The roof first," she agreed. The roof took most of the first day. The problem was exactly what it appeared to be. From ground level, a section of hand-split shingles near the north eave, perhaps 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, where a branch had come down. At some point you could see where it had struck, could trace the path of impact in the lifted and cracked shingles, and where subsequent seasons of rain and snowmelt had worked through the gap and reached the ceiling log beneath. The stain on that log was old enough to have dried and re-wetted several times, but when Silas pressed it with his thumb, the wood was still firm. The damage had not progressed past the surface. Silas found the spare shingles in the storage alcove at the back of the cabin, a natural hollow in the cliff face behind the main room, accessible through a low door that Wren had initially thought was a root cellar entrance. It was larger than it looked from outside, perhaps 10 feet deep and 8 wide, the walls carved smooth with wooden shelving along both sides. Half the shelves were empty, But the lowest level held provisions wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with pine tar, a tin of salt-dried beans in a sealed jar, cornmeal in a waxed sack, several coils of good hemp rope, a folded wool blanket, a small tin of axle grease, and stacked flat and bound with twine against the back wall spare shingles. A full bundle of them still serviceable, their edges true. Wren stood in the doorway of the alcove and looked at those shelves for a long time. The careful arrangement of them, the oilcloth and the pine tar, the shingles placed exactly where they would be needed. "He thought of everything," she said. "He thought of us," Silas said from behind her. "He just didn't know our names yet." They improvised a ladder from pine lengths stored against the cabin's east wall. Merrow had left those too, which she was not surprised by anymore, and Silas went up while Wren held the base. The wind came up around mid-morning and made the whole arrangement uncomfortable, and the shingles were heavier than they looked. And there was a period of about an hour when the wind and the cold and the awkwardness of the angle combined into something genuinely unpleasant. Wren held the ladder and didn't say anything about the wind. Silas worked without complaint. By noon, the section was replaced. The line was true, and from below you could not tell where the new shingles ended and the old began. "Clean," Wren said, looking up at it. "It'll hold," Silas said, coming down. The chinking was Wren's work, and she preferred it that way. She had done it before at the Delwood, re-chinking the root cellar wall after a wet spring had worked some of the old mixture loose, and she understood its requirements. It was slow and precise and unglamorous and entirely unforgiving of inattention. You could not rush it and have it hold. You could not approximate the mixture and have it last. It required a particular quality of patience that was not passive, but active. The patience of someone who understands that doing a thing correctly the first time is always faster than doing it incorrectly, and then doing it again. Augustine Merrow had described his method in a practical footnote at the bottom of his letter, a detail that Wren had almost passed over. In the larger weight of reading, clay from the gorge bank mixed with dried moss and water to a consistency he compared to thick porridge, applied by hand in sections from the foundation upward, left to dry before the adjacent section was started. She spent the better part of the second day on the south wall, filling a bucket from the gorge bank. Clay deposit she found exactly where Merrow's footnote suggested it would be gathering dried moss from the rock faces above the spray line, mixing it to the described consistency in one of the tin pots from the storage alcove. It was cold work. The temperature that day did not rise much past 40 degrees, and the water she mixed into the clay was cold from the channel. And by mid-morning her hands were stiff enough that she had to stop periodically and hold them close to her body until the feeling came back. She did not ask Silas to take over, because Silas had his own work assessing the eastern flat, clearing the immediate ground nearest the cabin, beginning the inventory of the tools. She did not ask because it was her work to do, and she knew how to do it. She worked section by section, pressing the clay and moss mixture into the gaps with her fingers, smoothing it flat, moving up the wall in careful rows. Her hands were dark with clay by midday. Her back ached from the bending. By mid-afternoon, the cold had moved into her fingers in a way that was beyond mere discomfort. She finished the south wall at 3:45 by the angle of the light. She stepped back and looked at it. The chinking was even and clean pressed fully into every gap, the surface smooth enough that it would harden correctly and hold through the winter's freeze and thaw. She looked at the entire wall from foundation to eave and could not find a section she would do differently. She packed up the tools and went inside and held her hands near the fire for 10 minutes, flexing her fingers until the feeling came back fully. Then she started preparing supper. The water channel was the third day. Wren had inspected it the first morning and noted that the flow into the collection basin, while constant, was narrower than she thought it should be. The channel itself was clear for most of its length, but approximately 4 feet up from the spring source in the cliff face, there was a section where the stone lip had developed a crack, and sediment had accumulated in that crack over what appeared to be several seasons, narrowing the channel's effective width by more than half. She worked on it alone while Silas was outside splitting wood from the downed pines along the gorge wall. She used the smaller of the 2 chisels from the tool crate, working by feel as much as by sight in the low light near the base of the cliff. The sediment was not stone, it was compacted mineral deposit and fine grit, the kind that accumulates slowly in still water over years, and the chisel moved through it in small, careful strokes, not hammering, coaxing, understanding what needed to be removed and what needed to be left. The cold water ran over her fingers constantly as she worked, which was one of the more purely uncomfortable physical experiences of her recent life. And she noted this observation with the detached practicality she brought to most physical discomforts, and continued working. She worked the section in careful stages, clearing a few inches at a time and watching how the flow responded. It responded well. Each stage of clearing produced a measurable increase in the thread of water moving through the channel. And when she cleared the final inch of accumulated material from the cracked section and sat back on her heels and watched the flow in the basin below, very nearly doubled. She watched it for a long moment. "There," she said, quietly to herself, to the cabin, to no one in particular. She stood up and flexed her cold hands and looked at the water running cleanly through its carved channel into the basin, steady and cold and reliable, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing restored to its proper function. She did not think about the fact that Augustine Merrow had carved this channel with his own hands, that he had sat in approximately this position and done approximately this work for the first time decades ago, that his hands had shaped the stone her hands were now resting against. She thought about this later at supper when Silas asked what she had done with her morning, and she explained, and he listened in his attentive way. "He built it to last," Silas said. "He built it to be repaired," Wren said. "There's a difference. Something built to last assumes it won't need attention. Something built to be repaired assumes someone will come along and give it that attention. He was counting on us." Silas was quiet for a moment. "That's a considerable amount of faith," he said. "It is," Wren said. "I think he had it." On the 4th day, Silas assessed the eastern flat. The soil was real dark, deep, noticeably richer than the rocky ground elsewhere in the gorge, but 2 seasons of unmanaged growth had sent brush encroaching significantly from the tree line. The flat itself was perhaps a 1/4 acre of workable ground, sheltered on 3 sides, open to the south and its light. Silas dug a test hole at its center, going 18 inches down, and the soil was dark all the way. He reported this to Wren in the evening with the careful neutrality of someone who is keeping himself from being too hopeful. She listened and wrote the details in her notebook. That night they talked about what the flat could produce and about the south-facing slope the land around them suggested, but which they had not yet found the path to, and about the spring that didn't fail, and about the winter that was coming, and how prepared this hidden place seemed to be for exactly that. They talked about all of it plainly, the way they talked about everything. And then Wren put down her notebook and looked at the fire and said quietly, "There's something I need to tell you." Silas waited. She told him what she had heard from Beatrice Holst in the Granton market before they left. The land near Harwick. The companies from the east buying through the summer. The warning that had come with the particular expression of someone who wanted to be kind but also could not pretend she did not know what she knew. Silas listened without interrupting. "I knew before we left," she said. "I knew when we were packing the wagon. I knew when we were on the road." The fire moved between them. The waterfall murmured through the rock. "Why didn't you say?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "Because you needed a reason to go, not a reason to stop and calculate whether going made sense. You were already carrying the weight of the decision and the weight of the situation. And I thought," she paused, choosing the words, "I thought the road would give us something. I didn't know what. I only knew that staying in Granton wasn't it. And I was right about that." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the fire settled and needed a piece of wood, and Wren put one on. "You were right," he said finally. "I know," she said. "But I should have told you." "Yes," he said. "I'm telling you now," she said. "I know," he said. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed, not the silence of resolution exactly, but of two people who have been honest with each other and are sitting with the fact of it, which is always slightly uncomfortable and always necessary. They sat in it without trying to fill it. Then Silas said, "The road gave us this." Wren looked at the room, the fire, the stone walls, the spring in its channel, the seeds on the shelf, the chinking she had pressed in with her own cold hands. "Yes," she said, "it did." They rode to Harwick on horseback, leaving the wagon on the shelf above the gorge, where it had been since the first evening. The road down from the mountains was a day and a half of steady riding the country, opening gradually as they descended, the pines thinning and the sky expanding and the temperature rising by degrees until by the time they reached the valley floor, it felt almost like September again. Harwick was a working town, not large, not prosperous in any conspicuous way, but functional and settled in the manner of towns that have existed long enough to stop explaining themselves. The land office was on the main street, a low building with weathered board siding and a wood stove that was burning hard against the October cold and throwing enough heat that Wren felt it when they were still in the doorway. Doyle Farnham looked up from behind the counter. He was a compact man, shorter than average, with the kind of careful stillness that comes from decades of reading documents and weighing their significance. He wore a canvas vest over a dark wool shirt and a pair of spectacles on a length of thin cord. He had the expression of a man who has reviewed a very great many claims and been deceived by a notable fraction of them, and has consequently developed a precise and reliable method for determining which is which. Silas set the deed on the counter. He said, We'd like to discuss a property transfer. Farnham took the deed and read it. He read it with the same expression he had worn when they walked in, neutral, attentive, giving nothing away. He turned the page over and examined the reverse. He looked at the signatures below the transfer language for a long moment. Then he reached behind him and took a heavy ledger from the shelf, setting it on the counter and opening it toward the back. He ran his finger down a column of entries, moving back through the pages back further, until he found what he was looking for. He read the entry and looked up. "Augustine Merrow," he said. "Yes," Silas said. "Filed this deed in the fall of 1883, Farnham said. He tapped the ledger entry with one finger. "It's recorded here. No subsequent transfer. No tax lien." He paused and his finger moved slightly on the page. "Property taxes were paid forward at the time of filing, 10 years in advance." He looked up over his spectacles. "They run through 1893. Silas's arm, where it rested on the counter near Wren's, pressed slightly against her. She kept her face composed. "The transfer language is unusual," Farnham continued. "But it's not irregular. Conditional transfers have precedent. This one stipulates intent to inhabit and work the land. Can you demonstrate that?" Wren said, "We've been on the property 4 days." Farnham's eyes moved to her. "We replaced a damaged roof section on the north eave," she said. "Rechinked the entire south wall using clay and moss from the gorge. Cleared and restored the water channel to full flow. Inventoried and assessed all provisions left on the property. Began assessment of the soil in the eastern flat." She paused. "We've also carried in our own provisions and tools. We intend to stay through the winter and begin working the flat in spring." Farnham regarded her for a moment over the spectacles. Then he looked at Silas, then back at Wren. "You did all of that in 4 days, he said. "We had reason to," Wren said. Something shifted in Farnham's expression, not warmth exactly, because warmth was not the currency he traded in, but a quality of assessment that had reached its conclusion. He looked at the deed again. He uncapped his pen. "I'll need your full names and today's date," he said, "and I'll record the transfer in the ledger. You'll want to keep both this deed and the registration copy I'll make you in a safe place." He paused very briefly. "Given your circumstances." "We have a storage room carved from solid rock," Wren said, "lined with tin." Something moved across Farnham's face that might in different light have been a smile. He bent over the ledger and began to write. Then he stopped. He set the pen down and looked at Wren with the expression of a man who is about to say something outside the ordinary course of his professional duties and is deciding whether to say it. He said it. "Mr. Merrow came to this office," Farnham said, "in the fall of 1887, 2 years ago." Wren went still. "He wanted to know if anyone had registered the transfer," Farnham said. "I told him no one had." He was quiet for a moment, the way I remembered him from when he first filed, a man who thought before he spoke. Farnham looked at his ledger rather than at either of them. "He said something before he left. I wrote it down because it was the kind of thing I thought I might want to have a record of. He said, 'The person I'm waiting for will be someone who sees what other people walk past.'" Farnham looked up. He looked directly at Wren. "I don't know how you found the place," he said, "but I expect you were the one who found it." Wren met his eyes. She did not look away, and she did not color, and she did not offer any of the modest disclaimers that the moment might have invited. She simply looked at him with the same calm, level expression she had worn throughout, and said, "Yes." Farnham held her gaze for one more moment. Then he picked up his pen and finished writing the entry. The recording took 20 minutes. When it was complete, Farnham made a copy on heavier paper, blotted it, and slid both documents across the counter. Wren took them. She folded them with care and placed them inside her coat in the inside pocket where the original letter had ridden since the first evening. They bought supplies before leaving town: flour and salt pork and dried beans and candle tallow, a new chimney glass for the lantern clear and uncracked, a paper of vegetable seeds from the general store's end-of-season remnants, a bolt of heavy wool flannel that Wren selected by weight and weave, holding it against the light from the window before she agreed to it. She did not explain to the storekeeper what it was for. They were on the road back before noon. The horses loaded, the light already beginning its long autumn slant toward the west. The weather turned an hour from the gorge. There was no dramatic announcement. The sky simply closed over in the way that mountain weather sometimes does quickly, completely without negotiation. And what had been a cold but clear afternoon became within 30 minutes a serious rain driving in from the northwest. The temperature dropped as the rain came in the way it does in October at elevation, and what fell as rain at the valley floor would be something heavier before long at the height of the gorge. They rode without speaking, heads down, the horses steady beneath them. Wren thought about the documents inside her coat and about the oilcloth they would go into when they reached the cabin, and about the tin-lined storage room and the shelves Marrow had built to keep things dry. She thought about the fire that was waiting to be lit, and the provisions now in the saddlebags, and the chimney glass that would not be cracked tonight. She thought, too, about what Farnham had said, and she turned it over in her mind, the way she turned things she was not finished with. The person I'm waiting for will be someone who sees what other people walk past. She had seen it. She had sat by that fire on the first evening and looked at the cliff face across the gorge, and she had seen it, the seam in the rock, the shadow that was not shadow. Silas had looked and said it could be the cliff face. She had not argued. She had simply known what she knew and held it until morning. She had done that her whole life, noticed the thing, held the knowledge quietly, moved toward it when the time was right. She had not understood until now that this quality, which she had always thought of simply as paying attention, was something a man could build a plan around. That a man could build a cabin and leave a letter, and pay taxes forward for 10 years, and wait and be right about the person who would eventually come through the rock. The rain was heavy now. The trail in front of them had gone dark with water, and the footing was uncertain. The horses moved carefully, picking their steps. They were within sight of the ridge above the gorge when Silas's horse shifted on a wet section of trail, and Silas corrected and, in correcting, put his own foot wrong on a moss-covered stone at the trail's edge. He went down on one knee, caught himself on the horse's flank, and stood up. But the way he stood told Wren what had happened before he said anything. She was beside him in a moment. "Ankle," he said, his jaw set in the way it set when he was managing something. "Can you ride?" Yes. He did. But the last quarter mile to the shelf above the gorge was slow, and by the time they reached it, the rain was coming hard enough to make the descent to the pool genuinely treacherous. The waterfall below them, which had been 60 feet of beautiful white curtain in the afternoon light of their first evening, was now a 60-foot wall of sound and spray amplified by the rain, the mist indistinguishable from the downpour. Wren tied the horses and turned to Silas. She did not ask whether he could manage the descent. She assessed the situation directly: the slope, the rain, the darkness coming his ankle, the gap in the rock, the fire waiting to be lit. "I'll go first," she said. "You put your hand on my shoulder on the steep section." He did not argue. The descent was slow and unglamorous and wet in the complete and thorough way that cold rain makes everything wet. Wren moved ahead of Silas on the steeper sections and felt his hand on her shoulder, felt the slight irregularity in his weight that told her which steps he was favoring. She did not comment on it. She simply adjusted her pace to his and kept moving. At the pool, they stopped. The spray from the waterfall hit them immediately and fully, as though the rain itself had not been sufficient. The pool was higher than it had been 4 days ago, the rain-fed gorge pushing the water level up the sound enormous. The gap in the rock was still there. Of course, it was still there. "Me first," Wren said. She went through quickly, knowing the passage now, and came out into the sheltered space behind the waterfall, where the rain reached only as mist, and the sound was contained again to its constant presence. She turned around and reached back through the gap, her hand in the dark. She felt Silas find it. He came through slowly, carefully, one hand on hers, and one on the stone face. At the narrow point where his shoulders wanted to catch, he tilted and Wren pulled, and there was a moment of cold and awkwardness and effort that neither of them would have called dignified. And then he was through, and she had both hands on his arms, steadying him in the dark of the passage, and they moved together the last few feet into the sheltered space. Inside, safe. Wren had the fire lit in 10 minutes. She moved through the familiar sequence without hurry, finding the wood, setting the tinder, using the last of the dry matches in her coat pocket, which she had kept dry by some unconscious attention to where they were in relation to the rain. The fire caught and climbed and threw its amber light across the walls. Silas sat in one of the chairs with his boot off his ankle elevated on the tool crate, the color returning to his face by degrees. He watched Wren move around the cabin, hanging their wet coats near the fire, putting the new provisions onto the shelf, fitting the new chimney glass into the lantern and lighting it, setting water to heat on the hearthstone. The rain came down outside. The waterfall amplified beyond anything they had yet heard, a sound that was less like water and more like weather itself, raw and total. But inside the cabin, the stone walls held completely. The chimney drew clean. The fire was steady. Wren set a cup of heated water in front of Silas and sat down across the table. Outside, the rain hammered the cliff. The waterfall filled everything. "It's registered," she said. She said it plainly as a fact, because that was what it was. He nodded. "The ankle will be better in a few days. The supplies are in." The roof held. She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "We're all right, Silas." He looked at her across the table in the warm light. her hair still damp from the rain, her hands reddened from the cold and from 4 days of clay and stone and mountain work, the documents registered and safe inside her coat, which was hanging by the fire beginning to dry. He looked at her with the expression he wore when he was being completely honest about what he saw without reservation. "We are," he said. Later, after the fire was banked and Silas slept, Wren sat alone at the table for a while. She took the registered deed from her coat and unfolded it. She read it in the lamplight. Not the words exactly, she had read it enough times to know those, but the fact of it. The recorded transfer. Farnham's signature. Their names written in his careful hand below the transfer language. Silas and Wren Calloway. Intent declared. Property registered. She folded it again, placed it in the oilcloth, and took it to the storage alcove and set it on the highest shelf. The one she had decided was for things that must not be lost. She stood there in the narrow alcove for a moment in the dark, with the tin-lined walls around her, and the stone above her, and the cliff at her back, solid and permanent, and entirely indifferent to weather. Then she went back to the table and to the lamp, and to the quiet work of being exactly where she was supposed to be. November came in without ceremony. There was no single morning that announced it. Definitively no frost harder than the last, no wind more serious than the ones that had come before. It arrived the way most true things arrive, gradually and then completely. Until one morning Wren woke and built the fire, and looked out through the small window at the light, and understood that something had shifted. The quality of the cold had changed. It had weight to it now, a permanence that the October cold had only threatened. She put another piece of wood on the fire, and stood at the window for a moment looking at the sheltered courtyard through the glass. The spray from the waterfall had frosted overnight on the rock faces nearest the pool, a thin glaze of ice that caught the early light. The tall pines along the eastern edge stood very still. The sky above the gorge was the particular blue of high-altitude winter mornings, deep and clear, and entirely serious. She turned back to the room. It looked different than it had on the first morning when she had stood in this same spot and taken inventory of what was present and what was needed. The differences were not dramatic. They were the differences that accumulate through small daily decisions, each one unremarkable, the sum of them amounting to something that could not be mistaken for anything other than a life in progress. The new chimney glass in the lantern threw a clean, steady light each evening. The flannel curtains she had made from the bolt bought in Harwick cut and hemmed over 2 evenings at the table, using the paper of pins and the needle case from her sewing kit, hung at both windows, and the difference they made in the warmth of the room at night was measurable. Silas had split additional boards from a downed pine in the gorge and built a second shelf beside the fireplace, fitted to match the height of the original. And Wren had arranged their provisions on it with a care that was partly practical and partly something else, the particular attention of a person who understands that the way things are arranged in a space says something true about who lives there. The seeds were on the middle shelf, Augustine Merrow's jars, 7 of them each sealed with wax. Each labeled in his small, deliberate hand, stood alongside the paper packets from the Harwick General Store, the ones Wren had selected from the end-of-season remnants. 2 different sets of things from 2 different times, standing together on the same shelf. She looked at this arrangement each morning and found it correct. The registered deed was on the highest shelf inside its oilcloth, behind a flat piece of granite Silas had fitted as a ledge guard to keep things from sliding. You could not see it from the door. You had to know it was there. Silas's ankle had been tender for 4 days as she had predicted, and then it was not. He bore the limitation with the characteristic silence of a man who finds injury more irritating than painful. And Wren bore the additional hauling those 4 days required firewood from the gorge water from the pool. When the basin needed supplementing the ongoing work of settling in with the characteristic competence of a woman who has never found work beneath her. During those 4 days, something passed between them that did not require naming. It was the specific understanding that two people arrive at when they have depended on each other in the ordinary, unglamorous, entirely necessary ways, not in a crisis that asks for heroism, but in the daily accumulation of tasks that ask only for steadiness. Wren had held the ladder and carried the wood and pulled him through the gap in the rock in the rain. Silas had fixed the shelf and built the ladder, and assessed the flat and kept the fire through the night when she slept deeply for the first time since Granton. Neither of them made note of it. It simply became part of what they knew about each other, added to the existing store. It was Silas who found the compartment. He had been taking inventory of the tool crate beneath the table, removing each item, assessing its condition, cleaning what needed cleaning, wrapping what needed protecting, and had pulled the crate fully away from its position to get at a coil of wire that had slipped to the back. When the crate came away from the wall entirely and he set it aside, he saw the panel. It was set into the floor logs, fitted so cleanly that you would not have noticed it if you were not looking at the floor from exactly that angle. Not hidden, there was no deception in it, no attempt at concealment. Simply fitted the way a careful craftsman fits things, so that the joint was tight and the surface was flush, and the whole thing looked like floor, unless you were paying attention to the floor. Silas was always paying attention to the floor. It was one of the things Wren had noticed about him early on. His habit of looking down in unfamiliar structures, reading the state of the foundation and the state of what it supported. He called her name. She came from the storage alcove where she had been reorganizing the oilcloth wrap provisions. He pointed. She crouched and looked and found the edge of the panel with her fingers, and then the small iron ring flush-mounted that served as a handle. She looked at Silas. He looked at her. She lifted it. The compartment beneath was approximately the size of a large bread box lined in tin, the same careful tin lining as the storage alcove, the same attention to keeping moisture out. Inside were 3 items, each placed with the deliberateness of someone who had thought carefully about what they were leaving, and for whom. The first was a folded survey map drawn by hand on heavy paper, the property lines indicated in precise notation, and the topographic features rendered with a detail that spoke to years of close observation. Merrow's annotations were in the margins. Elevations, water sources, soil notes, seasonal observations. The map showed more than the immediate gorge. It showed land Wren and Silas had not yet seen. The second was a notebook. Small cloth covered the binding, still intact. Wren took it and opened it and saw immediately what it was. 30 years of observation recorded in Merrow's small and careful hand. First, frost dates for each year going back to 1861. Snowfall depths measured against a marked post he had evidently driven into the ground at the east edge of the flat. The angle of light at midsummer, noted by where the sun cleared the eastern gorge wall, and how long it held the flat before crossing. Wind direction, month by month, which way the storms came from and what they brought. 30 years. She sat down on the floor with the notebook open in her hands and read it for a while, turning pages carefully. Silas sat on the chair above her and looked at the map. The third item was an envelope, clean, sealed. Merrow's handwriting on the front. For those who have stayed. Wren set the notebook aside and opened the envelope. The letter inside was shorter than the first. The handwriting was the same deliberate, careful, slightly old-fashioned in its formation. But the pressure of the pen on the paper was different, lighter. The hand of a man who had grown older since the first letter. She read it aloud. If you have made it this far, you are already doing better than I expected. Not because I doubted the kind of person who would find this place. I have thought carefully about that person for many years, and I have considerable confidence in them. But because making it this far requires not just finding and claiming, but staying and staying is the thing that separates wanting from intending. The map shows the full extent of the property, which is larger than the immediate gorge. There is a south-facing bench above the cliff line, accessible by a trail that begins at the north end of the sheltered courtyard, that receives more direct sun than anywhere below. The soil there is deep. I meant to do more with it. I ran out of years. I hope you will not. The notebook is my record of 30 years here. The numbers are accurate. The observations are honest. Use what is useful, and set aside what is not. A note on the winters. The first frost comes to the low gorge in mid-October, as you have likely discovered. But the cabin holds its warmth well into November, if you keep the fire properly fed, and you are protected from the prevailing winds by the cliff on 3 sides. You will burn less wood than you think. The cliff gives back the heat it absorbs during the day, slowly through the night. Trust it. I am glad someone is reading this. That means the place is not forgotten. It means I was right about the person who would find it. I hope you are well. I hope the work is going forward. I hope the spring is running clean. A. Merrow Wren folded the letter and held it in her lap. The fire moved in the hearth. The waterfall murmured through the rock. Silas had set the map down and was looking at the middle distance in the way he looked at things he was turning over seriously. There's a bench, he said. Above the cliff line, Wren said. South-facing. A trail from the north end of the courtyard. He was quiet for a moment. We haven't found the trail. No, she said. We haven't looked. She looked down at the notebook in her hands. 30 years of attention recorded in careful columns. She thought about the man who had sat in this room at this table by this fire and written these things down with the specific intention of passing them forward to someone he would never meet. She thought about what that required, not just the patience of it, but the faith of it, the belief that the knowledge mattered enough to preserve, and that the person who would need it would eventually arrive. He was writing for us, she said. All of this. He was writing for us. Yes, Silas said. She set